Some of you may be thinking that it's strange to do a retrospective on a game that really isn't that old. Poppy Playtime is pretty much still in its infancy, given that we've only seen the release of 2 chapters and a spin-off that is currently in early access. However, there are multiple things to take into account before you get ahead of yourselves. For one, think about how different the landscape of the indie horror genre is compared to the time of Poppy Playtime's initial release. On top of that, think about how much of an impact Poppy Playtime had on that change in the scene. Despite the time period being pretty short, looking back at these chapters with the context of where we are now is actually going to be significantly different than our first experience with the material. Secondly, my views on the Poppy Playtime franchise have changed quite a bit with time. Every time I've spoken about either of the Poppy Playtime chapters in a video, it was right around the time the chapter came out. I think a retrospective for me in particular is very fair because I've not discussed this game in detail in quite some time. I've played it a lot, and if you've tuned into my streams, then you may have some idea of what I have to say, but for the most part, I am here to deliver you some fresh and possibly controversial the baddest takes. In this video, I will revisit and re-review both Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, and I will also dedicate some time to talking about Project Playtime and the current state of that spin-off game. Without further ado, let's start off with the game that changed indie horror and arguably horror as a whole, Poppy Playtime Chapter 1. Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 has actually received a major update, some even call it a remaster, very recently, so this is actually the perfect time to revisit it and give it a definitive review of the definitive version. This update is a graphical improvement and fixes some bugs, but the game is still the same, basically, so there won't be much for me to catch you up on. I have always said that I think Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 is pretty solid. The presentation and aesthetic of Poppy Playtime has always been on point, and this series as a whole has some of the best environment work I have seen in an indie horror title. You could make the argument that it doesn't have a very distinct style that separates it from everything else, but its level of quality is enough to establish the fact that Poppy Playtime has something to offer. Everything is polished, the place is perfectly lit, and despite how outlandish this factor can get, everything feels surprisingly real. The puzzles in this game, that the franchise has become known for, are totally inoffensive. I don't love them, I don't think they're anything fantastic, but I'm totally fine with them. I actually think they're pretty much the perfect level of difficulty. They are not so brain-dead easy that you can fly by a puzzle on your first try, but they are also not needlessly complicated nonsense that will drive you crazy. I do hope that the future chapters provide a little more creativity to these puzzles, because I do think they have more potential, and that is explored a little bit in Poppy Playtime Chapter 2, but these puzzles are still a totally fine part of the game. My main issue with this game has technically been resolved, but it still does stand because of how long it took to change. Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 was $5 on release. As much as I actually do get enjoyment out of this game, and think it's a really good starting point for Poppy Playtime as an IP, this should have been a free first chapter from the beginning. It is now free, and Chapter 2 acts as paid-for DLC, on Steam at least, but Chapter 1 was $5 for several months, and there is simply not enough content to warrant that price. Even from a business perspective, giving a wider audience something to look forward to with the next chapter is easier to do with a free first release, so I don't understand why they did this. But thankfully Chapter 1 is now free on Steam for people to just check out, which is how I think it should have been. And of course, you cannot talk about Poppy Playtime Chapter 1 without discussing the amazing chase sequence. The jump scare of Huggy Wuggy coming out of the shadows is perfect and immediately gives the player a sense of panic, and that panic is what carries the entire chase. Every turn and every encounter with the antagonist continues that pattern of fear and shock that makes this honestly simple chase extremely thrilling. The music and the sounds of Huggy getting closer and closer makes this experience incredibly tense even when you're not in that much danger. And the little extra pieces, such as the need to crouch into a small opening or a door shutting in front of you, make this such a packed chase despite, again, how simple it is. Realistically, this chase is pretty straightforward, and there are parts where you literally don't even have a chance of dying, but the use of visual scares and sound design constantly keeps you afraid and in shock, making this a brilliant chase sequence. And I genuinely love Huggy Wuggy's design. I really don't understand what people don't like about this character. I truly believe that the influence Huggy's type of design has had on the indie horror scene is where the disdain for the character comes from, because there is nothing to hate here. I love his tall and lanky body and his sharp teeth. He isn't the scariest monster ever, but he gets the job done, and he is undeniably iconic. Chapter 1 is a short and simple experience that, although lacking in overall content, acts as a totally serviceable first chapter to Poppy Playtime. Again, I feel like this game should have been free on release, with a paid second chapter, but it's better late than never. It's cool, it's interesting, and it has a grand finish. Never have my feelings on a game changed over time quite as much as they have with Poppy Playtime Chapter 2. There have been games that I didn't like the first time playing and then eventually grew to appreciate, but never have I grown to appreciate a game quite as much as I have Chapter 2. When I first played this game, I didn't like it. I found it tedious, I got frustrated, and I was very close-minded. But now that I have played it a lot more than I would like to admit, and had a full year and a half since its release to grow to appreciate it, I simply really like this game. There are still things I really don't like about it, and one of those is basically a focal point of the game, so I am not saying there aren't problems. But overall, I like Poppy Playtime Chapter 2, and it's about time I come out and say that straight up. I like it. We'll start off by discussing the three main minigames: Musical Memory, Whack-A-Wuggy, and Statues. Musical Memory is just Simon Says, and I do think that is inherently a little bit lame, but it is the best way I've seen Simon Says be implemented into an indie horror game, and other games have tried. The present and active threat being literally lowered to you from above gives the game a certain level of tension. Bunzo is also just one of my favorite Poppy Playtime characters, so it makes me happy to see him. And although the difficulty from this game definitely comes down to me having a bad memory and my inability to focus, I do find Musical Memory pretty hard, even though I've done it several dozens of times. The later rounds last a really long time and introduce so many strange buttons that I often forget the patterns and fail to this day. There's a part of me that feels like this sequence is too long, but the suspense that builds during the game and the actual difficulty of the challenge would all go away if you were to make it shorter, so I actually think this game is perfect for what it is. Whack-A-Wuggy is still the game I have the most problems with, though. When I play this game at the default brightness, or god forbid lower, I have such a hard time seeing some of the Wuggies. Specifically ones that are like in corners and high up, the light that is provided just doesn't really reach them. I don't necessarily think the game needs to be brighter. I think the lighting that it has just needs to be worked differently in a way that makes each and every hole somewhat visible. I would also say this is simply the most boring of the three. I can't really explain why Whack-A-Wuggy is more boring than literal Simon Says, but it just does not excite me at all, and it lasts a long time. It's a totally sufficient sequence to keep the game going, but it being one of the three main sections of the game is just a little bit tragic. The last minigame is, of course, Statues, featuring the wonderful PJ Pugapillar, another one of my personal favorite characters from this series. I have mixed feelings on this one, but overall I think it's pretty good. This one is essentially red light, green light, and in a horror setting, if done right, I think that's a totally solid format for a sequence. Since it's such a simple concept, it can often be done bad, such as the wonderful Slow Celine sequence, quote-unquote, in Garden of Banban 2. Something I really like about this game is the sound of PJ getting closer to you. Hearing the music and then the sound of little skittering footsteps heading towards you is pretty eerie. This game, like Musical Memory, does a great job at building tension with a pretty simple concept. My main issue with Statues at launch, and this still applies to some extent, is that it wasn't very clear what to do at the end, and if you made it to the very end of the room, you would just watch PJ walk directly into rubble. However, they have updated the game, adding a flashing light to really highlight the window that you're supposed to break through. I still think they should have taken into account what would happen if someone made it to the end of the room, but making the window more apparent does help a lot, so not much to complain about now. Now that we've gone over the main games, I'm going to take a break from talking about gameplay to discuss more visual and auditory elements. Once again, Poppy Playtime has great environments. Everything feels so dreary and lively at the same time. The environmental artists for Poppy have found a way to make such an unrealistic location with a borderline whimsical style and make it feel pretty damn real. I kind of see the Playtime Co. factory as the mascot horror equivalent to Willy Wonka's factory. It doesn't make any logical sense, and it is such an unrealistic location for its dedicated purpose, but it still feels like it makes sense, and it's surprisingly immersive. And the animation is all on point, and way above the expectations of most of the indie scene. Every cutscene is clean, Poppy actually moves like a doll that came to life, Mommy Longlegs' movements are very fluid, everything in the animation department is top tier. But now that I've mentioned her, I feel the need to go on a rant before we get back to talking about gameplay. Mommy Longlegs is easily my least favorite thing in Poppy Playtime Chapter 2. First of all, her voice and the way she talks drives me crazy. It is awful. I'm not going to talk about this in a PG way. She talks in this disgusting, sensual voice as if she is trying to seduce the player. She does not sound threatening or powerful, she sounds aroused. The voice acting during her death is top tier, absolutely perfect in every way. So, this isn't even a critique of the voice actor. This is just the way they decided to write her. She isn't even a horror character in my eyes. She is straight up hentai bait. And her design is the most boring design in the franchise. She literally is not a spider. She has 4 legs, and each pair are very far apart. So if you think of her higher pair of legs as arms, then she straight up has the limbs of a human being. She is literally 3 balls with limbs. Spiders' bodies aren't even divided like this, and it doesn't make the design better, so I don't know what the idea was. And this chapter's chase sequence is so inferior to the first's, and that probably has to do with how much worse the character chasing you is. Like I said before, Huggy's tall and lanky appearance with his large smile and sharp teeth is actually a really solid monster design in my opinion. He is just a ferocious monster with the intent to kill, and that is it. And that is made perfectly clear despite how little screen time he has. All of Chapter 2 establishes Mommy Longlegs as a cringy, non-threatening character, so when she is chasing after me to kill me, it's an absolute joke. My biggest problem with Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 is not the lack of a threat or a lack of danger. I've heard some people say stuff like that because there are plenty of points in the game where you aren't in any real danger, but I'm actually okay with that. My biggest problem with Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 is that the big bad, the main antagonist, is one of the worst horror antagonists I have seen. But I like most other things about the game, so let's move on. The puzzles in this game are a step up from the base game, like I briefly mentioned. They take a little more thought and effort, and the introduction of the green hand obviously introduces some new mechanics that result in pretty satisfying puzzles. Again, these kinds of puzzles aren't my favorite thing, personally, but they got better between chapters and are satisfying, so again, I think they're fine, totally inoffensive. This little maze section with Kissy and Barry, the cart that utilizes the green hand mechanic, is also a pretty fun and simple puzzle that doesn't feel like padding but also doesn't require too much brain power. Same goes for creating the Bunzo plush. The use of the buttons that change the conveyor belts both for paths and to navigate the Bunzo plush are decent puzzles and again are simple but don't really feel like a waste of time by any means. The only one of these mini sequences that I do think is just kind of a waste of time and not fun is the room with Brawn and the Claw. This is just slow and boring and doesn't really utilize any interesting mechanics that the game has, nor is it really even a puzzle. But it isn't that long, even if it's slow, so I can't complain much. And despite how underwhelming the actual final chase is, everything that leads up to it is actually really solid. This puzzle with the different colored levers is easy as piss, but this whole puzzle slash segment of making a gear to proceed in order to start the chase is cool. I think what I like about this game, and the reason that I find it so satisfying to replay over and over, is that everything is so one after the other. What I mean is that there are essentially no moments where it feels like you're doing nothing. Like, you'll have musical memory, a major sequence, then bronze room, a brief sequence, then this short puzzle, and then lastly you make it to the game station, ready for the next major sequence. There are parts of this game that I think are worse than others. Again, I don't really love Bronze Room, but the game doesn't dwell on insignificant sequences or anything. None of the sequences overstay their welcome, and everything is pretty straightforward. However, there are some exceptions to this, and they give me another reason to hate Mommy Longlegs. Mommy Longlegs talks so much in this game, and it's basically never interesting in the slightest, and she straight up makes the game longer in places it doesn't need to be. The absolute best example of this happening is in Whack-A-Wuggy. At the start of Whack-A-Wuggy, there's a TV that explains to you how the game works and tells you everything that you need to know. And before the game starts, Mommy Longlegs chimes in to tell you how Whack-A-Wuggy functioned in the past. That by itself is fine, whatever. But then after you beat Whack-A-Wuggy, Mommy Longlegs congratulates you, opens the vent that you leave out of partially to give you something, just to close it again, talk some more, and then finally open it. The fact that it opens part way just for it to close again so she can talk more is such a fucking middle finger. Mommy Longlegs breaks the flow of this game just to be an uninteresting character. However, my overall point still stands. Despite some unnecessary interruptions, Poppy Playtime Chapter 2 is pretty consistent in providing its content to you outright and doesn't dwell when it doesn't need to. Again, this game is not perfect, and it does have moments that would be benefited by some serious changes, but when you play every sequence one after the other, it's just a consistently good game. So those are my general current thoughts on both chapters of Poppy Playtime. Again, I never thought I'd like them quite as much as I do, but I simply do. Again, I think Chapter 1 should have been free at launch, and Chapter 2 has its dull moments and an antagonist I really do not like, but I think both are quite enjoyable and when put together, make a very satisfying package. However, as you probably know, there is another game in the Poppy Playtime franchise that is completely unrelated to its main chapter-based release. Oh yeah, I'm talking about Project Playtime. I fucking love this game. First of all, the maps in this game are basically perfect. There has only been a single map added since launch, which I do believe to be a problem, but the 3 maps are exactly what they need to be. Factory is definitely the weakest map with the least unique style and most cluttered environment, but I do still like it and think it serves a purpose. Because of how cluttered it is, this map actually works surprisingly well for chases because both the survivor and the killer need to navigate the map, and whoever does so better will be the victor. I think having a lot of constant obstacles does actually help with a chase because, again, the better player will win. However, my favorite map is still Theater. I think everything about this map is perfect. Aesthetically, it is distinct and pleasant to look at. The multiple floors work so well for variety and gameplay. The combination of open areas and tight cluttered areas is excellent. Theater is just a perfect map. The last map, Destroy a Toy, is close to perfect. The main issue is mostly that it is the least optimized and runs the worst of any map on pretty much everyone's device. However, from a purely design perspective, it is nearly flawless in my eyes. As opposed to Theater's multiple floors and multiple rooms, or Factory's small area with a lot of obstacles and rooms, Destroy a Toy is a massive area, only somewhat divided into rooms at certain points, with a basement that is almost a straight-up maze. I actually think this map works really well because of its sheer size. It doesn't matter that there is so much open space or barriers that every monster can easily navigate, because the survivors can be so spread out that in an ideal scenario, you can literally have every person a decent distance away from the killer. Destroy a Toy also looks ridiculously cool. Again, I think it could use some optimizing, even to this day, but the aesthetic and style is executed really well. So that's how the maps play, but let's get into our monsters. Boxy Boo has been nerfed a lot over time, arguably too much, but he is still my favorite character to play. His jump now takes longer to charge, but it is still my favorite mechanic. You can achieve so much distance using Boxy's jump, and that works really well when charging towards the survivor, because Boxy is the loudest character when walking, so jumping is actually your best way of sneaking up on someone as well. But of course, it's also just good for very long distances. Boxy's grab also has a longer cooldown now, but it is also a very useful tool, because if you land a grab and start attacking someone as soon as they're pulled towards you, then you're going to take them down pretty quickly. Boxy's crazy mobility is what draws him to me, even if he isn't the technically best character whatsoever, and we are going to get into that. He is my favorite to play pretty much solely because of his crazy jumping. Mommy Longlegs is not only practically my least favorite Poppy Playtime character, she has unfortunately become pretty obsolete in Project Playtime. Her webs from back in the day have been completely removed. Mommy Longlegs no longer has the ability to slow down people with her webs. Which, for the record, I actually do prefer to the alternative. Back in the early days of Project Playtime, Mommy Longlegs, if she were to find you and used her webs, you literally couldn't do anything. You would basically be standing perfectly still as the killer annihilates you with no consequence or even effort. However, without said webs, she is basically a pointless character. The special moves that Mommy Longlegs has are her ability to see everyone's vague location for a little bit, and her hand that she can use to grapple onto things and travel farther quickly. These moves are valuable and fine, but do not put her on the same levels as the other characters. She's a totally fine character, but without an ability that puts her on par with the others, I really don't see much value in her. But overall, I still like Mommy Longlegs more as a killer than the last one we had to talk about, but for the exact opposite reason. Huggy Wuggy is way too overpowered. Huggy Wuggy has literally every single advantage over every other monster, and he is the only character in the game who has not received a nerf in the last half a year. Huggy is the strongest monster. He has the longest range of any monster, and the length of his arms is shorter than his actual range. He is insanely fast, despite already having the strength and range advantage. He isn't even the loudest, despite the speed and range advantage. He is quieter than Boxy. He has a one-shot kill that has no build-up or audio or visual cue, and even his little Huggies are ridiculous, because you can just place all 5 of them directly in front of puzzle pillars, so nobody can do puzzles without alerting the killer. Huggy has literally every advantage except for the ability to travel long distances using a special move like Boxy's jump or Mommy's reach, but it's not like he's a slow character, and his one shot lasts a really long time and is a speed boost as well. For some reason, Huggy is the only character that Mob refuses to nerf, and that leaves him as a free win unless you are a bad player or you are playing with really good players. If everyone is just an okay player, Huggy is a guaranteed win. However, I do still love this game, so let's get more into that. The puzzle pillars, despite being so simple as a concept, are one of the biggest advantages Project has over other asymmetric horror games, like Dead by Daylight, for example. Having little puzzles that you actually need to focus on and complete as fast as possible is a way better mechanic than sitting at a generator and occasionally having to press a single button. It's better for multiple reasons. It's way more engaging and actually pretty fun. It actually provides a challenge to create an obstacle that gets in the way of your progress. And lastly, your ability to do the puzzles actually plays a role in how long it takes to finish the pillar, unlike, say, a generator in DBD, where you have no way of controlling how long it takes. I don't want to say Project is better than Dead by Daylight, because I know that's too bold of a claim, but this is my explanation as to why I like it more. In a multiplayer asymmetric horror game like this, there are always going to be more survivors than killers. In DBD, there is 1 killer and 4 survivors. In Project Playtime, there is 1 killer and 6 survivors. Even in the new Texas Chainsaw Massacre game, there are 3 killers, but there are 4 survivors. Because of this fact that applies to all of these games for obvious balancing and game design reasons, prioritizing the enjoyability of being a survivor is crucial. All of these games succeed at making it fun to be a killer. That is a way easier thing to get right. But in order for these games to work and be fun, it has to be fun to be on either side. Texas did a pretty good job of that because of its wider variety in mechanics. DBD is okay at that, but Project does the best in my opinion because accomplishing the goal is actually engaging. Not to mention the mobility in Project Playtime. That's the other advantage that it has over the other asymmetric horror games that I've mentioned. The ability to jump, roll, crouch, and use the grab pack to navigate the environment provides a way more enjoyable experience than the much more basic movement in a game like Dead by Daylight. The swings in particular add so much depth to the movement, and it's incredibly fun to have that ability. Again, I'm not going to say Project Playtime is the best asym, because I don't even really believe that. I think Project has too many problems and not enough content to rival the genre's other giants right now. However, it is my favorite because of how much the survivors are able to do relative to said other games. And although I think there are some basic balancing and gameplay issues that need to be worked on in Project, the main issue with comparing it to the other options in the genre is the lack of content. Phase 2 was a fun release with a new map and new puzzles and a rework of how XP and perks work. It was a very nice update that has been thoroughly patched over time to work as well as possible. However, it has been roughly 10 months since Project Playtime's launch, and they have yet to add a new killer, and Destroy a Toy is the only new map. The content within Project is some of my favorite in the genre, but there isn't enough content to keep people in general interested and excited. I don't expect Project to keep up with the consistent releases of Dead by Daylight, because comparing Mob Entertainment to Behavior Interactive is such an unbelievably unfair comparison. However, there should definitely be more by now overall. Project Playtime has its problems, and again, I don't think it's technically as good as much as I personally enjoy it, but this game has a lot of potential and is a really fun time. I love the movement of the characters, I love the map design, I love the aesthetic, and Boxy is so baby. In conclusion, I really like Poppy Playtime now. I think my initial disliking of Chapter 2 really just came down to disappointment, because that does still apply to some extent. I think Poppy Playtime has the most potential of any indie horror game, and it has yet to reach that full potential. I do feel like there are a lot of things Poppy Chapter 2 could have and should have done to capture a better tone and be more of a horror experience. However, that seems to be exactly what Chapter 3 is going for. If Poppy Playtime Chapter 3 can be an elevated version of Chapter 2 with more horror-focused game design, I feel like it'll be one of the best games the genre has to offer. The pieces are all in place, and the studio has some of the greatest talent it could have for the job. We just have to see if they succeed. I personally think the chance of this flopping is pretty small, but until an actual gameplay trailer comes out, I won't speak too highly of it. But what we have seen so far has been quite impressive and jaw-droppingly high quality. Poppy Playtime's first 2 chapters are a pretty fun time so far, with plenty of great ideas on display, and the franchise just so happens to have a very enjoyable spin-off to boot. Again, I think people, including myself, have given this series too hard of a time. It has plenty of flaws, and I can only hope those flaws will be a top priority of the studios going forward. But as it is right now, Poppy Playtime has really won me over, and I cannot help but be thrilled and excited for the franchise's future.